the world has seen a new set of challenges that has emerged. These challenges are, some of them, we saw the trends emerging long before. Some of the challenges have been more recent, but they are those, particularly the challenge posed by the ISIS, which also wants to call itself the Islamic State. Yesterday I was anchoring a TV show which is going to be shown subsequently by two experts who said that we should not give the ISIS credibility by calling them an Islamic State because they don't really represent Islam in its correct form. But having said that, it's important to understand the challenge that they pose, because that challenge is going to be having effect on our lives in various parts of the world. The ISIS, as you know, ladies and gentlemen, has become extremely popular with wide range of social media users. And this is because the ISIS has begun to market itself very effectively on the largest platform available in the world across a whole range of social media initiatives, whether it's Facebook, whether it's Twitter, and whatever else. They tend to attract a large number of people with very well-placed marketing adverts of what they are doing, which is really quite horrifying, but it seems to attract people. Fortunately, I can say in the beginning itself, they haven't had many takers in India, which is a country with a very large Muslim population, but barring aside a handful of people here and there, they haven't been able to pick up the kind of numbers that they would probably be able to target in a large society like ours. So what is the ISIS? The ISIS essentially is a much more violent form of the Al-Qaeda's philosophy. And while the Al-Qaeda does have a philosophical resonance running from Morocco to Pakistan and then beyond, even into Southeast Asia, and interestingly, there are some takers for the ISIS message, even in a country like Australia, which per capita has the largest number of people wanting to get onto the ISIS bandwagon, just as they are from developed countries like in Europe. So the ISIS really defies explanation, and many analysts have not been able to understand what it's all about. It has kept people baffled. Where did it suddenly come about? And why is it so popular in the poorest countries in the world, in as much as countries with very high GDP and per capita income? Some of the Scandinavian countries, for example. The ISIS found its popularity emerging out of many atrocities that took place in Iraq. Following the American invasion in Iraq and thereafter the mishandling of the Shia-Sunni mix in Iraq, emerged the ISIS. The ISIS subsequently began to get support from many rich and wealthy Arab countries. Analysts say Saudi Arabia, Qatar, amongst others, have been funding the ISIS. Other than that, there are many rich philanthropists that fund the ISIS. What is the ISIS attempting to do now? What was it set up for? It was essentially set up for countering the regime of Hafiz Assad and his son, President Assad right now in Syria, because it was intended to create a counter to the Shia dominant regime in Syria. Now that counter has spun out of control. It has now become a terrorist state, quite literally a state, with a landmass they control which is as big as Jordan, some say as big as Britain. Now they have resources, they have money, they are regularly earning money through sale in the black market of oil wells that they now control in parts of Mosul and other parts of northern Iraq. Who are they being countered by? The Western countries are making pronouncements about countering ISIS, and some have resorted to bombings. But the counter to the ISIS has to really come at two levels. One is a global movement to counter their message, and more specifically on the ground, with troops on the ground who put boots on the ground. Interestingly, two countries or two entities that are really fighting ISIS are not finding a place on the global negotiating table where the ISIS should be countered. One is Iran, because Iran is a Shia dominant country, and Iran sees ISIS as a challenge to its own Shia message. And on the other hand, there are the Peshmergas of the Kurds, who are a kind of nationality in their own right, but spread over 3 countries, that's Iran, Iraq, and Turkey. ISIS enjoys a lot of popularity in the Arab world because the suppressed societies there and the youth there tend to find in the ISIS the possibility of doing things which they are not able to do in their own society. Figures show that over 90% of Saudis find it acceptable. There are about over 60% of people in Turkey who are finding the message of ISIS acceptable. What is ISIS going to do? It's going to keep Middle East in flames over the next several years, if not decades. And unless there is a collective drive to counter the ISIS instead of looking at it in a piecemeal situation, the Middle East is going to be in turmoil. And if the Middle East is in turmoil, one of the factors that really affects us in India, actually 2. One is our energy security. Bulk of our hydrocarbon imports, bulk of our oil requirements come from the Middle East. And the Middle East, being in turmoil, places a certain uncertainty on our energy sources. The other is a large Indian population that is living in the Middle East, and by some figures they send in more than $30 million worth of repatriated funds to India. Now all that can go into a tizzy if that population feels insecure and decides to come back to India, which will have obviously an adverse effect on the economies of at least certain states in India, which are the coastal states, which depend a lot on the funding coming in from those citizens of those states who've gone and sought work and a lifestyle there. So there is that one factor. The other factor is the turmoil in the Arab world, which could lead to conflicts and more conflicts, and therefore indirectly impinge on what we regard as a very important factor, which is our energy security. So the ISIS is wanting to propagate a caliphate. I'll come to the energy security a bit later. The ISIS is wanting to propagate a caliphate. What is the caliphate? The caliphate was, as some of you would know, essentially philosophically ran from Spain to what they now see as Khorasan, which is parts of Western India, Pakistan, China, etc. In the maps they have floated, they see India as a possible country that they could take over also by initiating all sorts of conflicts. They are in conflict already with elements that used to operate from Pakistan, the Al-Qaeda, the Taliban, and various other groups who are proxies that operate from Pakistan with or without the support of the state of Pakistan. Forgive me, Pakistani guests, if this offends you, but that's the reality. The second point is that the ISIS is keen to usher in an era which takes Middle East back in time several centuries. They are running a state, but within the state that they are running, they are known for their ruthlessness and their large number of atrocities, particularly against those who want to be interacting with the rest of the world, taxi drivers who want to listen to radio outside of ISIS radio stations, women who don't want to wear the hijab or niqab. So there is a problem there. But once you get into the sway of the ISIS and you get into their control, it's very, very difficult for people to get back. Social media attractions have attracted youth for a larger mission. We had one case from Bengal, a chap called Shami Witness, but the police is now obviously far more alerted and seized of the fact. Now, energy security. Where does it come from? What is it going to lead to? The first thing about energy security is that energy security is not just about, ensuring that an X amount of oil and energy reserves come to you. You have to also ensure as a nation state that the energy security that you require the sources of those energy security, that is the oil wells and the critical infrastructure that is connected with the production of energy, is secure. That is becoming less and less the case in the Middle East in the last couple of years. There are more internal conflicts and interstate conflicts in the Middle East in the last 2 years than have been in the last 2 decades. Look at the case of Saudi Arabia and the Gulf countries going after the new regime in Yemen. You see, the war in Syria has not abated for 4 years. We now have reports about Russia getting physically and militarily involved in Syria because it sees the importance of Mr. Assad's regime to remain intact there to further Russian interest. If the toppling of Assad, Russia would lose a fair amount of control over the dynamics of Middle East politics. Latest reports say they have moved in tanks, ships and ground troops. Eventually, if they can bring stability into Russia, into Syria, Russia sees the West may be more accommodative to Russia's own occupation of Crimea and Ukraine. Back to energy security after which I'll get on to Russia. Energy security, we've seen a dramatic drop in oil prices. Why is there a dramatic drop in oil prices? People attribute 3 reasons. Reason 1, they say, is because the Saudis have decided to outproduce all others so that the prices of oil would come down, and thereby the new discovery of shale oil, which is an alternative and energy base in terms of energy for the rest of the world. Bulk of it is now being used and hoping to be used in the United States, is much cheaper to excavate from the earth. The second thing is that if the shale oil industry takes off, the Middle East would anyway have to calculate its entire finances based on half the prices on which they had made budgetary estimate 2 years ago, which is about $100 a barrel. We're now looking at less than $50, sometimes $40 might fall even further once Iran joined back in the global cartel after the sanctions are fully lifted. So there is a desire by the Saudis to keep oil prices so low and keep producing so much that the shale industry can't compete with the oil industry, which requires at least a selling rate of $70 a barrel for the shale industry to be able to compete with the oil industry. Other than that, it doesn't become cost effective for them to continue to explore shale and sell shale. The third factor is that some people say that the Saudis and others are being pushed by the United States to keep the oil prices down, so that Russia, which is a major exporter of oil, feels the huge economic pinch, because Russia had based its budgetary calculation and its militarization calculation based on a factor of about $100 a barrel. Now, if that comes down to less than half, then entire budgetary calculations of Russia goes down. And if that goes down, then Russia's ability to flex its muscles worldwide decreases, which is what the United States wants and its allies want. How Russia is going to counter that, I'll just briefly come to that. The second factor is that, the second issue to understand is that there is a certain amount of exploration that is taking place in the Arctic area and deep sea explorations near Brazil and elsewhere. But this is not going to become useful to the world economy for at least another 15 years. The third thing to understand is that energy security now is not just based on your ability to get oil at a particular rate, and Indian companies could do well right now to capitalize on the low rates in the world market and fill up our reserves for a contingency in future. And India has the money. It puts in more than 3% of its GDP just to export oil, and that was based on figures when oil was above $80 a barrel. Since it's half the rate, we can double our imports. But the problem for India in particular is that we don't have the storage capacity of the kind that if we were to double our imports to take in. Alternate source of energy, which is equally important for our economy, could come from countries like Indonesia, which has very good coal, and some other countries where we could look at even importing alternatives like shale. But all that is going to take time. In the near future, oil and oil prices will dictate the state of our economy for some years to come. There is a view that India, along with Japan and China, could cooperate together to provide a certain degree of security and stability to the oil wells and the oil sources, which are so important for these three countries and their growth plan. But can we do it? Now, we can only do it if the parts of the world where oil can be imported from are more secure and stable. Our experience has been that right across parts of Africa and the Arab world, and sometimes not so much in the case of Latin America, but in these two blocks, the stability that is required for us to ensure that we can put in some feet on the ground to ensure the security of the region is not there. It will amount to getting involved in intrastate conflict and interstate conflicts. And that is something which is a larger political debate which cannot be resolved overnight by an individual country's decision, even if China wishes to play that game. Now, China and Russia are playing that game to some extent in the Middle East. But before I get to Russia again, let me also tell you that China's requirement of energy is so huge that China, as some of you may have noticed, has begun flexing its muscles, A, in the South China Sea, B, it has signed a $400 billion deal with the Russians to get Siberian oil over the next 30 years. Apparently, I'm told, it is at a very favorable rate. But the interesting dimension is both Russia and China seem to think they've got themselves a good deal. The reality is the deal needs to be implemented with infrastructure worth $70 billion to be put in place for the oil to come to China unhindered for the next 3 decades. So where is China going to get its oil from? China will continue to get its oil from the Middle East largely. But China feels that the entire route that Chinese vessels follow from Middle East going south of India and through the Straits of Malacca puts China into both an expensive cartage route, at the same time into a state of vulnerability, because the Straits of Malacca, in the event of an Indo-China conflict, can be blocked very easily by the Indian Navy, which is very powerful in that part of the high seas. So China has therefore struck a deal with Pakistan to build the economic corridor. It was in the news some time ago. China has decided to invest in Pakistan, not just for energy purposes, but for a variety of other reasons, to open an economic corridor running from the northern parts of Pakistan, or what we call occupied Kashmir, from Gilgit-Baltistan, running through Pakistan and going to the port of Gwadar, which has been handed over by Pakistan to China for whatever uses China wishes to see. Military experts in India are concerned that China would use it for militarization of the Indian Ocean. But Pakistan and China have officially said that the purpose of that is to give China greater access and interactivity with the Arab world and the African markets, both of the places where China has the deep pockets to make investment in and buy the reserves from, whether it's mineral or oil or whatever. But I think the big thing about China which concerns us in India is a very clear design stated by the current Chinese president, and it has been consistent over the years actually, that China wants to regain its historical role in world affairs. It's already a big player in world affairs. And those in India who have illusions that India can counter China, I think they will remain as illusions, because the reality is the Chinese economy is much bigger than us, despite the hiccups of the Shanghai Stock Exchange and some recent downturns and the slowing down of the Chinese economy. But the fact is that China has huge economic reserves even now. Two, China has decided very specifically to militarize, not just to counter any kind of border engagement with India, but more specifically to go back to its old territorial claims, whether it's against Taiwan, whether it's against call for a surrender after the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki with atomic bombs, and therefore Japanese withdrew. But China takes it as a military victory over Japan. They have huge territorial issues with Japan, but they have massive trade with Japan, which runs into the tune of $350 billion upwards. So there is no reason why China will not trade with India, but still have territorial issues, which to my mind will never get resolved till such time His Holiness Dalai Lama continues to be in India. China has a problem with Dalai Lama's presence and the Tibetan refugees in India. It's a reality we have to accept. It was one of the issues that India extended in 1959, Dalai Lama a place in India in Dharamshala, and it has always been the position of the Indian government that we have this trump card against China. I don't know if the trump card is going to work or not, but in the reality is that the Chinese don't want the Dalai Lama around in India before they can look for a settlement of the border issues. China tends to view history very historically, very selectively, pardon me, and therefore what suits China, they quote from that historical document, as in the South China Sea. They go back to documents which China claims the territory was theirs in 223 BC onwards. Whereas what doesn't suit them is the historical arrangement of the Shimla Agreement of 1914, when the then government of the Chinese Empire signed a deal with the Indian government on what India calls is the defining border between India and China, but China doesn't recognize that. So there are inconsistencies in the Chinese stand. But the biggest concern for India is the fact that China continues to prop up Pakistan as a counter to India's growth, so that India doesn't contest China's position and place for hegemony of Asia. So there is that dimension of Sino-Indian relations, and which will remain the case more so now that Pakistan finds itself gradually being isolated by the Western powers, because they don't see much use for Pakistan now that the Americans and NATO are going to pull out of Afghanistan. And therefore there will be a new set of initiatives that the West will launch against Pakistan, or those that are harbored in Pakistan as non-state actors. And this is obviously going to make Pakistan lean more and more towards China, both economically, strategically and militarily. There has always been a very deep cooperation between the two. But before I come to Pakistan, India, China nexus, let me also throw a little light on the Russian dimension. Russia has become increasingly aggressive over the last 5 years or so. Mr. Putin feels that Russia had been edged out of world affairs, has not been denied its rightful place in world affairs, and militarily, some would argue that Russia is still the second most powerful nation in the world, not China. Now, why it is using its military muscle is to achieve its 3 or 4 strategic aims. One is to counter the effort by American-led initiatives to take over the mindset of the entire European countries, including the former Soviet bloc countries, which are now part of Europe. Now, if America is able to do that, you have Russia feeling a great sense of pressure, because it seems to get cornered on the European front. In the Arab world, Russia has always had a stake and wants to go back to play a bigger role. Most recently, as I said, that it has expressed clearly, and there is an Institute for the Study of War in Washington which has confirmed these figures, that Russian troops have now moved in the outskirts of Syria and are now willing to engage in battle there. Since the Americans and others are reluctant to put boots on the ground, Russia has a two-pronged objective. One is to stabilize the Assad regime in Syria. Two, to counter the menace of ISIS, which seems to attract many Central Asian recruits, more than 4,000 people from Central Asian countries, which are in many ways satellites of Moscow, have moved towards the ISIS terrain and territory. Russia wants to stall that, and of course be a negotiator in any future deal that will come out of the Middle East, because it's an area of conflict which will continue to be. Russia has 2 or 3 sources of strength. The first is a dictatorial political system which doesn't give cause for much debate. On the contrary, if you look at India, while Modi ji has got this big vision about the world and has just taken again America by storm a year after his last visit, he's facing a lot of opposition and criticism at home. Clearly, it appears that other political parties don't want him to become so strong that they can never get back to power. Russia doesn't have any of that. Putin doesn't brook any opposition. The second thing is, Russia is a huge manufacturer of weapon systems. Now that weapon systems allows Russia to buy its way into the hearts and minds of countries that feel alienated and isolated. In the past, they did it with India when we were outside the Western fold, as it were. And now they have begun to engage much more actively with China and even look at selling weapon systems to Pakistan. Now this is something obviously which is causing concern in New Delhi, but up to a point, not beyond a point, because India has found other sources of weapon suppliers, because we have the hard cash now to buy it, which we did not in the past. The third thing that Russia sees itself being able to do is that it has an ability to both get into conflict and stabilize conflict situations because of the enormous military power it has. Now collectively, therefore, Russia cannot be ignored. Can it have an impact on India? Strategically, in the bigger picture, yes, it can have an impact on India if Russia and China get closer and closer together. But an interesting dimension which is often not spoken about, that some of the weapon systems that India and Russia are manufacturing together, whether it's the BrahMos missile, which is one of its kind and very popular with various countries wanting to buy it, Russia has given India permission to sell that to Vietnam, and Vietnam is another small enemy of the Chinese. So there are movements taking place in the world where we in India are going to be in the flow chart of. The second thing about Russia which is of concern to India is the coming together of Russia for energy and military purposes, and as a counter to America's muscle flexing in various parts of the world. And this, some analysts say, could be the start of the next Cold War. Now, yes, the world is trying to pretend that it's not there, but I think the Cold War, the second Cold War has already started. And it's going to see more and more involvement of countries, and you'll be asked to make a choice. You're either with us or against us. It is a choice that Washington has thrown up to India many times over in the last couple of years. But India is still a bit reluctant to join the Washington and American bandwagon. Finally, America in itself is being required to enter into a strategic overstretch. Now that strategic overstretch is going to have implications for the world economy. Because if America gets involved in conflicts, the American markets don't behave happily. If they don't behave happily, it has a ripple effect on all the economies in the world, whether you are physically engaged with the Americans or not. America has decided to put 50% of its naval fleet in Asia, which was not the case until a few years ago. So therefore, a strong American military presence in Asia is obviously something which China is willing to challenge and is not happy about. And then on the East European side, America is up against Russia, where it sees the Russian occupation of Ukraine as something which is contrary to the philosophies of the modern world and the post-Cold War era, where democracy and democratic choices were given to nations. Finally, India. What are the other threats that India faces? Most specifically, the threat that India faces is from terror groups that operate out of Pakistan. Now, there are many official accounts from Pakistan which say that they don't have the approval of the Pakistani state, but dispassionate academic analysis done by various experts who've spent 10 years or more in Pakistan say otherwise. It is very clearly established that the Pakistan military from the days of General Zia adopted a doctrine of bleeding India by 1,000 cuts. And that was one way that the Pakistanis felt that they did not need to use their actual military resources to confront India, but use proxies. The most prominent and the example to Mumbai was the attack of 26/11, where all the evidence and information available to us, not just us, but even to the United States, pointed towards Lashkar-e-Toiba, which enjoys a quasi-governmental status in Pakistan, especially in the areas that border India and Pakistan, which is east of Pakistan and west of India. So therefore, Hafiz Saeed is now declared a global terrorist. There's a bounty on his head, but America has just done that to satisfy the UN and Resolution 1373, which really says that terrorism and terrorism-related activities must be sanctioned upon and condemned. Beyond that, America has not moved. It is very clear America is probably going to turn a Nelson's eye or a blind eye to some of the activities as long as it doesn't affect American interests. So what are India's choices? The first choice for India is to have a policy change. Now that policy change is already happening. There are signs of that. Some of that are evident in India insisting that terrorism is the central issue of debate between India and Pakistan, not Kashmir. Pakistan is not willing to accept that for their own reasons, because emotionally Pakistan has been very strongly behind the Kashmir issue. They feel that without getting Kashmir, the whole idea of Pakistan is incomplete. That's a debate I don't want to get into right now, which will take another half an hour, 45 minutes, but because I have limited time, so I'm just making my closing remark. The second is, there is a desire on the part of this government to move beyond just asking the world to condemn Pakistan and the sponsored groups that operate in Pakistan. Now, a large number of intelligent and educated people in Pakistan also condemn them. I have seen writings from a very eminent Pakistani writer, Khalid Ahmed, Beena Sarwar, Aisha Jalal, Hussain Haqqani. Many of them are declared persona non grata by the Pakistani deep state, which is the military establishment which runs it. But the fact is, many intelligent people feel that this is not the route that Pakistan should be taken. But once you are in that tunnel, it's very difficult to retrieve and get out of it. So therefore, Pakistan's caught up in a bind where the civil society doesn't see merit in this, but there are a large number of people who we earlier called the fringe, but now they've become the vast majority, the lower and lower middle classes. Now those people seem to get resonance from the so-called charitable work that Hafiz Saeed and his gang does. But Hafiz Saeed is actually the founder of a group called Markaz-e-Dawah al-Irshad, MDI, which has two organizations. One is the Lashkar-e-Toiba, the terror outfit, the militant outfit, which has told their followers that we'll get Kashmir for you even if the Pakistan army can't get it for you. And the other is the one that charitable work that does called Jamaat-ud-Dawa. They react much before anybody else during earthquakes, during national calamities. They give scholarships, they run schools. The Al-Dawa schools, I believe, have 140 branches in Pakistan. They collect money through various other initiatives, including the hides of sacrificed animals. So they're pretty organized. And they have the funding. They do get a certain funding, interestingly, from the government of Punjab in Pakistan, where the budgetary figures have shown on the internet that they have been given money for charitable purposes. But largely their sources of funding are their followers. So India has decided that whether people like it or not, and the West has always done it itself, gone in for political killings, but never admitted it. And there is a view in India that you need to step up the pressure on these groups. And some of them would require covert action. Covert action is not just about a Myanmar type raid or an Osama bin Laden type raid, because there are territorial issues and sovereignty issues that are involved. But nothing stops you from doing the covert action that Israelis often do, and they did it against Iranian nuclear scientists, and they continue to do with the rivals of Israel anywhere in the world. So it's a policy shift that India is adopting. And the second thing is to particularly bring in a coalition of countries who would put pressure on the Pakistani establishment to turn course. Not the people of Pakistan, because many of them don't support this kind of initiative, but the establishment, as what's her name, Christine Fair, in a book, Fighting to the End, has very clearly articulated that is the aim of the Pakistan army, to continue to use proxies against India. So as Mr. Modi said at the UN, you have to have one standard definition of terror. You can't have good terrorists and bad terrorists. Now, how does it affect us? It affects us in 3 or 4 ways. And that's my last bit of yarn that I like to throw out, and then I can answer questions if time permits. 1, it could impact severely on our economy, because it has shown 9/11 and beyond that you need only a handful of people to derail a big economy. You don't need armies to do that. The second thing is, it could impact our infrastructure and connected issues that are linked to our way of life, such as an attack at an airport could lead to obviously a loss of confidence on air travel in India. It was attempted with 26/11 attacks on the hotel industry to bring down business sentiment towards India. So such attacks would continue. The third is the attack at large public places, which would put in a sense of discomfort and panic. Some of that is achieved through the proxies of the LET and others, and some say they're proxies of the ISI, called the Indian Mujahideen, which is a large group of disenchanted Indian Muslims who are now operating on directions and funding that comes from across the border. So those are issues that could impact on the stability of our economy and our way of life and businesses. The bottom line is that those that support right-wing, hardened Islamic militarism or jihad do not find multi-plural, multicultural, multi-ethnic societies like ours or the United States acceptable. So it's a clash of two philosophies which will always see us at loggerheads. It's not going to get solved by one meeting between Nawaz and Modi. It will not get solved even with 10 meetings between Nawaz and Modi. But if the meetings take place and there are greater engagement between officials at all levels, then the blueprint can be laid out for more stability between the two, provided, as I've always argued, that the Pakistan military is brought into the dialogue process and the discourse. Because finally the shots, at least as far as India is concerned, even Afghanistan, China and the US, are called in Rawalpindi, which is the military headquarters. Those shots are not called by Islamabad. With that, ladies and gentlemen, I'll end, but if there are questions, I'm happy to answer.